Good evening and welcome to tonight's episode of What the Friday. Now, I do realize this is coming to y'all a little bit later than I normally do it on Friday night, but it's just been a wild day. But anyway, since I'm late getting this out, I'm gonna skip all the pleasantries and we're just gonna jump right into tonight's episode.
Welcome to What the Friday, an After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listening discretion is advised.
So imagine this. It's the fall of 1966. You and your co-workers are in a cemetery digging a grave. I'm sure that's enough to have your nerves on edge a little bit, but then you look up to see something flying above you. And it's not a bird, and it's not an airplane, and basically it's not Superman either. But as they watched it, it moved from tree to tree. Now, I'm not sure if they thought they were just seeing things or what, but only 3 days later, the creature was spotted again. Two couples were driving down a quiet country road in West Virginia that night. Suddenly, they see a creature that they said stood between 6 and 7 feet tall and had huge wings. Two men in the car, Roger Scarberry and Steve Millette, later told the Point Pleasant Register that what they saw had red glowing eyes, a wingspan of 10 feet, and it seemed to want to avoid the headlights from their car. And they also said that this creature could fly at amazing speeds, but it was somewhat awkward when it would run on the ground, and they witnessed this about the running because it had chased their car at first by flying, but then it landed and kind of clumsily ran into some nearby trees. Now, I'm sure the story sounded absurd. I mean, it sounds like something from maybe an LSD hallucination, and y'all, that's not an insinuation that anybody was doing drugs, so just let me make that clear. But they were in a small Appalachian town, and I'm sure folks there had to think they were crazy. Scarberry, he was very adamant about what he and the other three that had been in the car that night had seen. Now, you've probably guessed by now that I'm talking about the Mothman of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, I had never even heard of him until around 2002 when I watched the Mothman Prophecies movie with Richard Gere. Then I started doing some reading on my own about him, and I was really fascinated. I'm just going to say right now that the Mothman is my favorite cryptid. Well, anyway, of course, the reporters who were getting these stories of the Mothman were doubtful, and I can't say I wouldn't be either. I mean, a 6 or 7 foot winged monster with red glowing eyes? Yeah, right. Then over the next year, more and more sightings were reported. Another area newspaper, the Gettysburg Times, reported that there had been 8 sightings in a 3-day time period. 3 days. 2 of these people who reported seeing this creature were volunteer firemen. They said that it looked like a very large bird with large red eyes. And a man in Salem, West Virginia, said that one night while he was watching TV, he saw these strange patterns starting to go across his TV screen. And then he heard this weird noise outside. Well, he got up to investigate what that noise was, and when he shone his flashlight over into the direction that he had heard the noise, there was 2 red eyes just staring back at him. He said that it kind of made him think of, like the little reflectors that are on bicycles. And his dog disappeared. Now, many believe that the Mothman took his dog. Now, that man's name was Newell Partridge. Well, anytime something like this happens, scientists and science has to be brought into it to give a logical explanation. But a man that was named Dr. Robert L. Smith He was an associate professor of biology at West Virginia University. Well, he said that this was not some winged monster terrorizing everyone, and said that was more than likely a sandhill crane. Now, the sandhill crane, it stands about the height of an average man, and it even has like this bright red skin around its eyes. But now, the thing I don't agree with on here is most of the descriptions of the color of what people were seeing doesn't match that of a sandhill crane. So I feel like we can just kind of get rid of his opinion. But anyway, some of the people in the area, they took that theory and ran with it. And they said that the bird was malformed because it had lived in the TNT area and toxic materials could have been discharged in the nearby wildlife reserve, which in turn could have caused issues with the animals there. And the TNT area, what that was an area that during World War II, they used it to make like ammo and that type of stuff for the war. And there's been like paranormal explanations for the sightings also, and most of these explanations involve aliens and UFOs. But they also say that whatever these people were seeing could be a messenger of bad news or the cause of bad events. And that kind of sounds plausible to me, because just over a year after the Mothman was first sighted, something really terrible happened right there in Point Pleasant. There was a bridge. It was called the Silver Bridge. It had been built way back in 1928, and it connected Point Pleasant with Gallipolis, Ohio. Maybe I didn't say that right. But on the night of December 15th, 1967, traffic was horrible on that bridge for one reason or another. And it was packed with cars, and of course that put a lot of extra weight on the old bridge. Well, the bridge itself, when it was originally built, had been poorly built. There was nothing in place that prevented it from totally collapsing. So if one part collapsed, the rest of it went with it, and that's exactly what happened. So on that night in that December, without the slightest warning, an eye-bar, just one eye-bar near the top of the bridge on the Ohio side of the bridge, cracked. That started this instantaneous chain of events, and the chain snapped, throwing the bridge off of its balance. The bridge collapsed into pieces, which in turn dropped cars and anyone walking across the bridge into the frigid waters of the Ohio River below. 46 people died that night from either drowning or being just basically pulverized by the pieces of the bridge that was falling on top of them. Now, can you even imagine how horrible that would be? Like, you're just minding your own business, either driving or walking across the bridge, and for whatever reason, you're just going there, minding your own business, and suddenly you're plunged into freezing water. Well, it didn't take long for people to start connecting the Mothman sightings with the bridge collapse. Now, maybe he was there, to warn people that something bad was about to happen. Or did he cause the bridge to collapse? Now, I mentioned the Mothman prophecies earlier, but at first it was a book that was written back in 1975 by a man named John Keel. In it, he incorporates the actual events and accounts, but he adds some sci-fi type stuff with some UFOs and that type of thing. Well, this became the big thing that made the little town of Point Pleasant the iconic town that it is now. People flock there, and I mean often. And now, I'm not sure how long they've been doing it, but there's a festival in the fall, and my daughter and son-in-law and grandson have all been to that festival. But if you can't make it there for, the festival, there's also a Mothman museum to check out, and if you go, be sure to have your picture taken with the 12-foot tall, I think it's made of steel, Mothman statue that's out there. And he's even got huge ruby red eyes. Now, I would love to take a trip up there one fall and check out the festival. I mean, Courtney and Justin and Jax loved it, so I'm sure I would too. Our next monster makes its home in Maryland. In the 1730s, German immigrants settled there, and it wasn't long after the community was established, they started reporting that they were being terrorized by what they called the Snallygaster, which is German for quick spirit. They described the beast as being half reptile and half bird. Now, there wasn't much of a face at all to it. There was no eyes, but it had a gleaming metal-like beak, and inside the beak was razor-sharp teeth. Some accounts of the beast said that sometimes it would descend from the sky and snatch people with these tentacle-like arms, like what an octopus would have. Some even described it as a demon that had wings resembling a dragon's, only that on the end of these wings, he had claws. Now, others said that the creature had fur and wore the horns of goats. But everyone agreed that it has or had a reptilian tail. Now, over time, the name Snallygaster evolved into Snallygaster. And I'm not referring to those creatures that was on Harry Potter. Okay. But soon, the immigrant farmers were hanging 5-pointed stars on their barns in hopes of warding off the Snallygaster, or the Snallygaster. And they say that to this day, those stars that you see hanging on barns, like on the German American farms, are the same or similar to the ones that the immigrants used to ward off the monster. Well, the origins of this creature could possibly go back even further in history, though. The Native Americans depicted similar creatures in their drawings, and they called it the piazza bird. One story says that the piazza bird loved the taste of human flesh from eating the bodies that had been left on battlefields. Well, the piazza bird was enormous in size, and it lived in the cliffs of that area. A local chief there, his name was Chief Watoga, he had a few of his warriors hide in the trees near the entrance of the piazza bird's cave. Chief Watoga approached the cave, and as soon as the piazza bird saw him, he swooped down from where he was perched, and he attacked Chief Watoga. But his warriors came out of their hiding spots and killed the piazza bird by launching poisoned arrows with their bows. Now, could this piazza bird be the same creature that the German immigrants had seen in Maryland? Over the years, the legend of the Snallygaster started to fade away. But then, in 1909, it kind of had a revival because the Middletown Valley Register newspaper ran a story on the front page that was headlined with, "Beware the Snallygaster." Well, according to that article, a man named Bill Jefferson was walking along a quiet country road when suddenly this flying creature plummeted down at him from the sky, attacked him, and carried him away to the top of a hill that was close by. Now, once it was there, the creature slashed Jefferson's jugular vein with its razor-sharp teeth. He sucked the blood from the gaping wound. Sounds like more like a vampire, doesn't it? But it sucked the blood from a gaping wound that he had left in that jugular vein. And while he was doing that, he was gently fanning the man with his wings. Once it had drained Bill of all of his blood, he tossed his body down the hill and flew away. The description of the Snallygaster in this newspaper account was very similar to the other descriptions, except this time it had one eye in the center of its forehead like a cyclops. But that's not where the newspaper article's in. It goes on to tell the tale of a group of men battling this creature for over an hour near a train station, and they were finally able to chase it away. Well, as you can imagine, the newspaper's accounts of the Snallygasters was an overnight sensation, and the legend of the Snallygaster started spreading all over the United States. Now, it got to be such a big thing, and that the Smithsonian actually offered a reward for the carcass of the creature. And y'all get this, Theodore Roosevelt, who was the president at that time, he even thought about putting off his hunting trip to Africa so that he could hunt the beast himself. Well, soon people started to report that the Snallygaster was in West Virginia. 2 newspapers published accounts of seeing the Snallygaster in different places. Once on the cliff above town, and then it was seen again perched on a railroad trestle. And just a few days later, another newspaper reported that a Snallygaster had actually laid an egg in a local farmer's barn. Some local people put the egg in an incubator trying to hatch it, but it never hatched. But y'all, you know the thing is, if this even actually happened, we don't know how long something like that would have to sit. I mean, none of us then or now have ever hatched an egg from a Snallygaster. So I'm just wondering how long they let it incubate before they decided it was time to give up on it. Now, according to the legend, the Snallygaster died in Frog Hollow, Maryland. Apparently, there was a huge moonshine still, and it was so big that it put out this very strong aroma of that moonshine. Well, the Snallygaster flew in to see what the scent was, and he got too close. It fell into the mash in the still and drowned. The dead Snallygaster was found by government agents who had gotten a tip that there was some moonshining going on in that area. Well, the 2 agents were so stunned by what they found, they didn't know what to do with it, but they did know that they had came there to destroy the stills, and that's what they decided that they would do. They blew up that still with the Snallygaster still in it with 500 pounds of dynamite. I'm sure that blast, which was so huge, blew moonshine and pieces of the steel and the Snallygaster parts all over the place for miles. And that was the end of the Snallygaster sightings. Now, Snallygaster is a cryptid that I had never heard of until this week when I was doing the research for this episode. But it was pretty interesting. Now, I have a really good friend who lives in Maryland, but sadly, the Snallygaster is nothing that's ever came up in our conversations. I mean, I'm really surprised though, because we have some weird conversations. So I'm going to have to ask her next time I talk to her about the Snallygaster. Now, I do have questions about the story about what had happened to Bill Jefferson, though, because the information from that news article doesn't say if anybody was with him. So did anyone see what had happened to Bill and was like, yeah, it was a Snallygaster that did this to him? Or was it just that they assumed that's what had happened to him? I mean, did anybody really see it? But moving right along. And of course, we can't do this episode of Monsters without talking about the Windigo. Now, if you're a supernatural fan or you read Stephen King books, you're already familiar with the Windigo. But there's more to this creature than what's portrayed in mainstream media. The Windigo has even made appearances on My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic. But nearly all the depictions of the Windigo in film and novels are just totally inaccurate. The legend of the Windigo actually originates from spiritual beliefs held by the indigenous people up and down the eastern seaboard and even into the Great Lakes area. In a spiritual sense, the Windigo represents the spirit of winter, and it also symbolizes the consequences of selfishness. No matter how much the beliefs about the Windigo varies, the one thing that everyone agrees on is that the existence is very terrifying, and it has a voracious appetite for human flesh. And not only that, if you were to encounter a Windigo, you run the risk of being either turned into one or being eaten alive. And honestly, I'm not sure which would be worse. And like I've said, Hollywood has popularized Windigo and changed it so much that you're not sure what stories you find about are truthful or if they're just over dramatized for sensationalism. Now, I did find one that has a ring of originality to it, though. And the story takes place actually in northern Canada, where there was a wealthy man who wanted to go on a hunting trip in a place that no one had ever hunted. I mean, that makes sense if it should be like plentiful with deer or whatever he was hunting if nobody had been there, right? Well, he goes into this trading post near the area and he asks for a guide to go with him, but no one wanted to go. Then he meets up with this Aboriginal man named DeFago, who's willing to take him on that trip and guide him because he was very desperate for money. Now, the two set out on their hunting trip. In the first 2 days of the trip, they hunted, but they had no luck. Then on that third night, a windstorm came through that area, and the winds were like of epic proportions. The man wanted to get a better look at what was going on outside, but he was surprised to find that the trees were still and there wasn't even the slightest breeze. But he could still hear the wind blowing. And the more he listened, the more it sounded like it was calling DeFago's name. The man thought he was losing his mind, but when he turned around to look at DeFago, he wasn't in his sleeping bag, but he was in a corner crouching down in the tent, afraid of what he was hearing. The man asked DeFago what was going on, but he just brushed it off and said it was nothing. But the wind continued to call him, and DeFago was starting to grow more anxious. All of a sudden, DeFago sprang to his feet, and he tried to run out of the tent, but the man stopped him and wrestled him to the ground. The man begged him to not leave him there alone in the woods. When the wind howled his name again, DeFago broke free from the man and he ran out of the tent. And nearly the entire time that he's running away, he's screaming. But finally his voice faded into the distance. The next morning, the man left the tent and followed DeFago's footprints in the snow. But it wasn't long before he noticed that the length between the footprints were farther apart than what DeFago himself could have made. He kept following them anyway, all the way to the middle of the lake, and that's where they just stopped. There was no hole, so DeFago couldn't have fallen in through the ice into the lake. So had something just pulled him up into the sky? That made no sense to that man at all. Then all of a sudden, the wind started howling again, and the man could hear DeFago's voice. The man looked around, and there was no one or nothing to be seen. Of course, the man wanted to go and get the heck out of there, so he went back to his camp and packed everything up. And y'all, I probably would have just left everything there. Now, he did leave some food for DeFago just in case he came back to the campsite. And then he started trying to figure his way out of the woods. It took him several weeks, but he finally found his way back to civilization. And the very next year, that man came back to the same area to hunt. And at that time, or at that same trading post, the people there told him they didn't know what had happened to DeFago, but they never saw him again after he left with that man. One of the men there said that maybe it was a Windigo. Windigo. Gosh, y'all. Because it was supposed to come with the wind and drags you away very quickly and carries you into the sky. The man went on to do some hunting, but a few days later, he went back to the trading post. And while he was there, an Aboriginal man came in and sat down by the fire. The man thought that the other guy that came in looked familiar, so he went over to him and asked him if he was DeFago. But there was no reply. Then the man asked him if he was okay, and there was still no reply. Finally, that man lifted the Aboriginal man's hat off of his head and he screamed at what he saw. Under the hat, there was nothing but a pile of ashes. Now, this is my thoughts on this story. Now, I feel like the Windigo took to Fago because, like I said earlier, the Windigo symbolizes the consequences of being greedy. So he took to Fago because he was in urgent need for money. So he took the man hunting in that undiscovered area. So I guess maybe the Windigo saw that as greed. That story came from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. It's a series, and they have a really cool website. But it does seem to have more truth to it than most of the Hollywoodized stories do. All right, y'all, that's all I have time for tonight. But don't forget to come back in the morning for an all-new Weekend Weird Files. Y'all have a good night.